Nordic Identity. I will say a couple of things about how it started, what it is, and then I will tentatively talk about the relevance for the Baltic states. And I thought that I should start on a personal note as part of something called the Nordic Summer University. We visited Gripsholm Slot in Sweden, one of 4 castles from the time, if memory serves. And in the big hall, any castle sort of worth its salt, or worth its name, would have a huge hall, right? It's been like that since the Viking Age around here. And you know, there would be pictures of the crowned heads of Europe. This was sort of pictures sort of drawn up in the early 1600s. And of course, there would be 2 big doors. So there were big pictures of the crowned heads of France and England, etc. But then, because of the doors, there were 2 tiny little portraits of crowned heads. And who do you think had been given the dubious honor of being placed there for the tiny portraits instead of the big portraits? Well, one was the Sublime Porte, you know, the Ottoman, sort of the head of the Ottoman Empire. He was an infidel, so you know he got only a tiny little one. But over the other door, the Danish king. Right? So, ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't always so nice amongst the Nordic countries, okay? Which makes the topic so much more interesting. The amity. If we go back, you know, I'm a Norwegian, and Norway became a state, not a sovereign state, but a state in 1814. We're having the bicentennial, only a couple of years down the road. And it happened not because of any national fervor inside the country. It simply happened because Denmark found itself, of which Norway was part, found itself on the wrong side of the Napoleonic War. And Sweden, because of its relationship to Russia, had lost Finland to the Tsar. And since the European powers didn't want any Swedish revanchism, they thought Sweden had to be somehow reimbursed for the loss of Finland. So it got Norway. That's the long and short of it. Does this sound like the Nordic cooperation, the Nordic identity that we know? No, not at all. Not at all. Nordic identity, as we will be talking about it, you know, I'm not saying that these are not preconditions down the road there, but Nordic identity, as we know it, start in the 1800s. It starts somewhere around the end of the 1700s. You can see stirrings, you can see people saying things like, and this is a Swedish nobleman I'm quoting here, saying, everything that draws the Nordics together is good, everything that pulls them apart is bad. So, you know, you had those kinds of programmatic statements from some specific persons, but that doesn't make for a social phenomenon. In order for something to be a social phenomenon, it has to be present, and it somehow has to, if it really is going to become a political phenomenon with some clout, it has to become what a social scientist would call doxic. That is, part of public, of the received opinion, part of something you take as granted, right? Of the doxa, as the Greeks would put it. Neither should we forget that Denmark at the time had an empire-like structure. It's usually called a composite states, that new states in the Nordic countries, like Norway, like Iceland in 1944, like Greenland at any point, but there is a deal in operation between Denmark and Greenland, that Greenland can at some point strike out for sovereignty, and like the Faroese Islands, which is also in the queue here, and whose church actually broke off from the Danish mother church only a couple of years back. This is an ongoing work in the making, how the political geography of the Nordic region would look like. I would contend that the key issue when it comes to understanding Nordic identity is the emergence of a group of ideologies called Pan and then something. You probably know about PanSlavism. There was also Pan-Germanism. Since we're in Lithuania, I don't know where the Pan would go, so there's probably no Pan around here. It didn't pan out that way. But in terms of Scandinavia, you had a Pan-Scandinavian program That was a typical nationalist program. The key tenet of nationalism is we share the language, we share the culture, therefore we should also share a political unit. Now that means in the Scandinavian case that it's a question of whether you define something as dialects or as languages where the boundaries of the political unit should be drawn. And it's the same for pan-Germanists or pan-Slavists. You know, you could think of a nationalist project in Scandinavia based on the idea that the language and the culture was the same. As one theorist has it, a language is simply a dialect with an army and a navy behind it. We certainly can see that in Norwegian history, where we had an attempt by a regional minority to strike out and create their own language, and they had some success, mind you. Right? So we are so used to thinking about nationalisms in the Nordic countries as being given. There being a Swedish one, there being a Danish one, there being a Norwegian one. You only have to scratch the surface this much historically to see that you could have had a number of different other projects. And my reading of pan-Scandinavianism is that it's not an antithesis. It's not something very different from a nationalism. It's a nationalism with different borders. Now, Scandinavianism's first ordeal was 1864. You will recall that Prussia became United Germany through 3 wars, the first of which was a war against Denmark about Schleswig and Holstein. In particular, the result was that the Danes were soundly beaten. And there was a lot of talk from the Swedish king and also in Norway about our swords being ready to defend the brother people, etc., etc. When the Prussians came, there were no brothers to be seen. The whole thing flopped. And this was a sad moment, particularly for a number of intellectuals and artists. And don't forget that the number of people who are actually the chattering classes at this point is very, very small. It's one of the joys of doing intellectual history of Norway or Sweden in the 17 and 1800s, that the number of people you have to research is super small, right? The voices that are important for the new ideas is extremely small. And therefore we can also target the debates and find out what was going on by reading relatively few texts, which is nice, because it means that what we can establish in terms of what the debate was like is more solid and more sound. It's harder now with the internet. And what we can see is that there was a regrouping after 1864, where particular intellectuals would regroup and they would set up meetings and they would go to meetings, and these meetings, usually on the student level, very much like the remnant that is the Nordic Summer University, they would be carried on as these people stopped being students and became professionals. And I'll only give you one example of how this worked, and it's a key example. Lawyers, Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian lawyers would, although they would work in different legal environments, they would meet and they would compare what was going on in terms of new laws. Then they would decide how to streamline them, and they would go back and they would implement them on a national basis, but they would implement them in parallel. This is a super important part of Nordic identity. There are 2 important parts about it. One is that as years go by, languages and cultures and practices and mores will diverge, but you can counteract that in this way. The other thing is that there was nothing to hold this together except the unwritten deals between professionals. You went and had annual meetings where you decided such and such and such, but there was no supranational instance that looked after what was going on. This was simply a gentleman's agreement. No gentlewomen in sight and at the stage that we're talking about here. End of the 1900s, beginning of the 20th century. End of the 1800s, beginning of the 20th century, sorry. And this was a success. Since I landed here this morning, I've been asked twice about whether it is possible for Lithuania to evolve a Nordic identity. And I have answered firmly in the affirmative. because we have an historical example of this being done, namely Finland. You will recall that when Finland became a sovereign state in 1917, having broken with the idea of being a grand duchy and then a unit in Russia, the first thing it did was to look to your parts for international cooperation and even alliances. So the period until 1922, 1923 is a period of Finland trying to make rapport, set up ties to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. Well, not so much Romania, but it was drawn in. This went nowhere because the countries in question were simply quarreling and the things that were being set up were very, very short-lived. So Finland's reaction to all this was to recoil from Central Europe and to look to the Nordics. And this was no easy decision for the Finns to take, because the split in politics in Finland had been between the old people looking to Sweden and the new people looking to Russia. And this going towards Sweden, which was the old sort of the old gentry in the country, and where there was still a sizable minority that was sort of more better educated, had more money, etc. This was not an easy choice for Finland, but it did that. And in the course of 3+ decades, it had become a Nordic country. And that also showed in the way the Nordic countries were institutionalized. And what is possible for Finland is possible for any other Baltic country. I see no ipso facto, no inbuilt reason why that should be impossible. So en principe, as the French say, that should be possible. Now, why can we talk about what you know, with the 50s we got all these kind of different deals between the Nordics. It's a passport union, and you know everything about that since you come to a lecture like this, so I will just leave that. All the accomplishments of one of the host institutions, I will just leave that to one side because it's so well known. And rightly so, by the way. It's impressive, and comparatively in international relations, Nordic institutionalized cooperation is impressive. And what is most impressive about it is that it is underpinned by a lot of informal stuff, like telephone diplomacy between the states, etc. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, but I go on. Why is this so important? Why is it that this happens? And the first thing, in an age of nationalism, and we are still, I think, at the tail end of an age of nationalism, the first thing that people would say is, well, of course, they share the same language. Is it a prerequisite for a political unit to share the same language? The historical record shows in no uncertain terms that this is simply mistaken. It is what a scientist would call wrong. It is true that in a political environment of nationalism, having a common language helps a lot, and I used that when I talked about Scandinavianism being a potential nationalism, so I can't run away from that argument. But a language does not alone a political unit make. Look at the unification of Germany. Austria, parts of Switzerland, German-speaking, still remained separate political units, right? Why is that? Well, because anything that is a common marker can also be a marker of difference. To someone picking up, in all parts of the world when one studies the Nordics, one studies them together. There are very, very few institutes where they teach Swedish literature, for example. They teach Nordic literature. When you pick up a Nordic language, it's usually stochastic which one it is. It depends on what kind of people are teaching in the institution and what kind of organized ties are existing. You know, if you go to an institute in Italy, it's who they have in that university. And the institute, if they have one, will be called the Nordic University, right? Or the Nordic Institute. Language, in this case, you see what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. I'll give you just 2 examples. In Danish and Norwegian, the last letter of the alphabet is O, the A with the little ring on top. In Swedish, it's Ö, right? So what is the last but one in Swedish is the last in the 2 other ones. There have been attempts through the years to try and change this to have a common alphabet. No way. Because this has been an ingrained part of national identity. And we use it in everyday speech, from A to O, alpha and omega, right? The first and the last letters. And I don't know whether in Swedish you say from A to Ö, but you probably do, huh? Yeah, there you are, right? Another example, in Danish and Norwegian, the letter Ö will be a stung O, right? In Sweden, it's in the German style with the umlaut. Right? And again, down the years, there have been countless attempts at trying to standardize this, particularly in an age before electronics, you know, when you had to typeset everything. It would have been very nice to have just one letter, right? And to do away with this stung Ö altogether. No way again. Is this typical of the Scandinavians? Are they very quarrelsome when it comes to their languages? No. When Austria joined the European Union, they insisted on a list of, I think it was 6 or 7 or 8 words that should always be spelled differently in the German variant of the EU texts. One of these words would be Erdapfel, which means apple of the soil. The German word would be Kartoffel. The German word would be Kartoffel, both meaning potato. So every single time you have an EU document in German, you will come to the word potato, and there will be one of the words / the other word. The logic is exactly the same as between the Nordics. Let's not forget that these are separate languages. They may be similar, but they're not identical. Right? So exactly the point that they are so similar makes for an attempt to remind the world and oneself and the other that they are not the same. Right? I'm sure you have dialects in Lithuanian where you have different quarrels like that. At least any language that I know will have that. Right? And you know, you can be furious because obviously this other person doesn't understand how Lithuanian is really supposed to be spoken. I'm guessing now, I don't know. I was about to say I don't know one word of Lithuanian. That would be a lie, because I know Archo. But except for that, I know no Lithuanian whatsoever. Right? But the point is that similarity in culture, and this does not only go for language, it goes for culture generally. Similarity has to become politically relevant. It is not politically relevant as you start. You can see this blatantly in the case of ex-Yugoslavia. When Croatian was being set up as a language in writing, one chose the variant that was closest to Serbian, because of pan-Slavic sentiment. When Franjo Tuđman created the Croatian state we have today, he purged the language of words that he thought, and he was a medieval historian, that he thought would be Serbian or sound Serbian, and installed stuff that had gone out of use in Croatian years and years ago because he wanted the languages to be different. So any linguist who does social stuff will tell you that languages are also the result of politics. Right? So language as such does not explain Nordic identity. Another good candidate would be habit. I'm a big fan of habit as a force in social life. I mean, philosophers have a concept that they call contingency. That things are what they are because they are what they are. And I don't know about you, but I run my life on that principle. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know? If something seems to pan out, I continue doing it. Right? I mean, certainly there might be a number of different and better ways of doing it, more efficient and effective ways of doing it, but I keep on doing it the way I've always done because there are so many other things that are going on. Sort of, if something works, we just sort of. And habit is an important thing. You know, if you are a Danish politician or a Norwegian diplomat, and you're used to calling up your opposite numbers before you do stuff, why not continue doing it? It's worked so far, right? When there's a crisis, who do you call first? And make no mistake about it, politicians and diplomats, they always make a point of checking with their opposite numbers. And you know, what are we going to do now, right? Or they don't say that, of course. They say, what are you going to do now? They say. And then they listen in, and then there is a consensus formed. This is a thing in the EU, it's a thing in NATO, and it's a thing in the Nordic countries. And this is what social scientists call path dependency. Once you've sort of hit the course, you go on doing what you're doing. That is an explanation for Nordic cooperation. The only problem is that it's underspecifying the case, because it is an explanation for everything always staying the same. And we know that everything is not always staying the same. One of the coolest book titles of the last 10 years is Alexander Yurchak's book about the fall of the Soviet Union, that is called Everything Was Forever Until It Suddenly Was No More. Right? So habit is not a particularly strong contender, but it's part of the story. My answer is, I've already given my answer to why I think Nordicism or Nordic identity is so strong. It is that it is a nation-building project that failed. And it didn't fail spectacularly, it just failed. It just sort of fell away, and it left a heritage of common cultural stuff. But I have as a principle that I will always try and say something new when I'm kindly invited to give lectures. So I thought, what new can I say about Nordic identity? And this is maybe a very weak idea, but I will try it out on you. Anthropologists, you know anthropologists, they go to places that are not their own, they observe some social phenomenon, and they say, oh, gee, maybe we can find this phenomenon elsewhere as well. You know, it may be a taboo, it may be the potlatch. The phenomenon that I will try on you today is what is called a jocular relationship. Jocular from joke. Right? It's been observed in a number of places throughout the wide world, that you would have relations where kids would have an adult that is an authority, but is not a strong and hard authority that you can joke with. You know, in Sweden there is a word for uncle, farbror, which covers this. You know, a farbror is not necessarily your mother's or your brother's. Your mother's or your father's brother. It could be a friend of the family, on which it could be with very jocular terms. You know, that would always joke with you. And I actually had such one of my father's best friends when I grew up. So we had a jocular relationship. Now, the thing about the jocular relationship is that it bridges other social differences, right? Think of how you, if you know some people but you don't know them well, one of the easiest ways to be with them is to joke, because it's not really committing you, but you can play and sort of somehow try and form a social relationship through jokes, right? And I would contend that the Nordic identity has a jocular relationship side as a very important part of its, well, of what binds it together. And if you look at jokes that Swedes and Norwegians and Danes tell about one another, there are two things that strike you. One is that it begins at a very, very early age. I don't tell Swedish and Danish jokes at home, but all my kids, and my wife and I have 7 kids altogether, all my kids have at some point, aged 4 or 5 or 6, started to tell jokes about Danes and Swedes. When they get older, it's about Finns, but they are of a different caliber, as it were. They all involve drinking and other sort of, should we say, adult pursuits, right? But how is that? And it goes on year after year after year after year with kids. So that's the first thing, is it starts very early. It's part of the social repertoire from a very early stage. The second thing is, almost all of these jokes are reversible, in the sense that these jokes that Norwegians tell about Swedes, Swedes can also tell about Norwegians. Most of these jokes are very bad, so I will not give you a sample. It's bad anthropology, and anthropologists should always give samples, but I will just hide behind my political science cap and not give you an example. But they are interchangeable. So they are not barbed jokes, you know. They are not like, for example, and I'll be coming back to this, you know, in the Baltic, well, I'm a bit hesitant to talk about the Baltic region at all, because the first time I was in Tallinn was in 1991 at a seminar about Nordic-Baltic relations, very much like this one. And when it was a 2-day seminar, very nice, lots of drinking. And at the end there, we were going to Riga, to round it off with a day in Riga. And almost all the Estonian participants came with us. So we said, oh, you're not tired of going to Riga? And all of them, and almost all of them said, no, as a matter of fact, we've never been there. These were professors and students. And you know, aha. You would never, ever hear an adult intellectual from Sweden or Denmark or Norway say that they'd never been to the other countries. That would have been almost, well, it wouldn't have been unthinkable, but I would have liked to see that person, as it were. And I don't think they would have come clean on it. This is just part of the repertoire, you know, that you have friends and colleagues in these other countries. It's just part of what it is to be an intellectual in a Nordic country, right? And what does this tell us? This tells us that from a very, very early stage, Norwegians, and I'm not only talking about academics and intellectuals now, I'm talking about all Norwegians, through the jokes and other things, they have an image of what Swedes and Danes are. There is a category saying Swede, a category saying Dane, in a much more fine-grained way than any others. Any others. And that is super important, because it means that from a Norwegian perspective, Swedes and Danes aren't really foreigners. They're too close to be foreigners. You know, in ancient Russian history, they had a category called nashi pagani, you know, our infidels. And it would have been impossible, logically, to talk about our infidels because we were Christians. So how could non-Christians be ours, right? But still they had this category of our infidels. Our infidels, you know, they could be Palovtsi or they could be Hipchak or whatever, but they would be part of the group and then not part of the group. They would be what an anthropologist would call liminal, on the border between us and them. Right? And I strongly argue, and I'm not going to budge on this one, that to a Dane, for example, Danes are not necessarily wild about the Swedes, but Swedes, we know the Swedes. You know, we've always known the Swedes. We know how they talk, we know what they do, we know how they dress. They're not really foreign. We know too much about them for them to be foreign. They're sort of in between foreign and domestic, as it were. And that is, I think, a key to understanding the Nordic identity as a political phenomenon as well, because that demonstrates how important the non-formal cooperation part is. And this can be highly, I open a parenthesis, this can be highly embarrassing, by the way, because the Swedish image of the Norwegian is that he's a country bumpkin. So if you come and give an academic lecture, for example, there's always the first 5 minutes where you have to live down that stereotype before you sort of recategorized from being a Norwegian to being an academic, as it were. And it's like all identities, these things come with a price, right? But you know, we also have our stereotypes of them, so don't worry, you know, we get our own back. Baltics. As I said, Mindaugas, you should take over this lecture from here on, but I will sort of give some tentative thoughts. I've hit on what is, I think, is the key thing already, that the world expected there to be a Baltic region in 1989, 1990, 1991. And a number of people half-heartedly went along with it. But the only place in the world where I think there was such a thing as cooperation between Baltics would be in the US amongst dissidents that had been hanging out. And I've spoken to some of these people who went to conferences on the Baltics, sort of in the exile milieu in the US in the 70s and the 80s. And they said, okay, they were common, the conference was common, but you know, there wasn't really all that much contact between the three clans. It was simply because they needed some numbers so they could sort of organize this on some scale, you know. And what little rapport there was of a practical kind and not necessarily of an ideological kind, right? So one started, well, I mean, one example of academic work done on this is Heine Rebas, who was an academic before he shortly became the Estonian Minister of Defense at the beginning of the 1990s. He wrote an article where he just killed the entire idea of a Baltic region altogether. And you know, if you compare the jokes that are being told in this region, and at that time, about one another, they were not kind jokes at all. They were not the kind of jokes that Scandinavians and Nordics would tell about one another. I remember one joke. It's absolutely cruel. When this country joined the daylight saving time, you can tell me which year this was, but it was in the very early 90s. Yeah. And the joke in Estonia was that, yeah, of course they joined that. That's the only European institution they can join. That is not a very nice, that's not the kind of jokes that Nordics tell about one another. That's a barbed joke. That's a hostile joke, right? So, you know, there is a qualitative difference between the Baltic and the Nordic sort of well, basic stuff here. Now, in order the Nordic model, and in international relations and political science, there is such a thing as a Nordic model. They are two slightly different things. In political science, the Nordic model is a welfare state model, and it's a way of setting up labor relations, or as they say in the UK, industrial relations. It involves having a general framework for relationships between employers and employees. In Sweden, it points to a meeting, a classic meeting in a place called Saltsjöbaden in the 30s, but the Danes were actually doing it before, and the Norwegians were doing something very similar right after the war. So that's the sort of key thing about the Nordic model, and then you have all the welfare goods and all the rest of it. But in international relations, the Nordic model describes something else, which is a security community, a community of states where the idea of people attacking one another in warlike fashion, not being to the forefront. The idea that a security community is characterized by an expectation from all parties that conflicts are going to be solved without violence. Right? That's the key sort of Nordic thing that sets the Nordic states apart in international relations. Now, how does this look if we look at it from a Baltic point of view? The key there, you know, when you start talking about political units and political relations between relations between political units, there are two kinds that immediately spring to the eye. It would be relationships between majorities and minorities, particularly in this day and age, not always in history, but in this day and age, ethnic minorities, and it would be relations between states. Now, I would be the last person in the world to say that relations between ethnic minorities and majorities in the Scandinavian countries are frictionless. That would be a stupid thing to say. Denmark, when I was a young man, Denmark was the beacon of liberalism for Norwegians like myself. Going to Copenhagen was going to the continent. It was going to freedom, right? And it was sort of an example of how a liberal regime could look. One could hardly say that today, given what's happened in the sense of ethnic relations in Denmark. Right? But still, and this has soured relations between Denmark and Sweden, I think. You know, my colleague Pertti Juonemi has just done some research on this. He's a Finn. A Swedish-educated Finn, having been living in Denmark for 20 years, and he's been doing this paper on Danish attitudes towards Swedes. And this whole idea that Danes think that Swedes are naive about ethnic relations has become more and more important over the years where he's been living there. And vice versa, as seen from Sweden. What Denmark is doing is not particularly nice, right? So there are problems. That's not my point. But there is the expectation that these things will pan out and that one will sort of hold it down, as it were. Now, this cannot be said about the Baltic countries. If there was one political issue that the rest of the world really followed, where the Baltics were concerned in the 1990s, it was the question of Russian citizenship in Estonia and Latvia. And once that was, well, I wouldn't say settled, because there are a number of people who don't have a citizenship, and the state system is set up such that everyone is supposed to have one. But once that faded, there was still the question of ethnic minorities. And I see to my chagrin that this is an ongoing concern, not least in this country. And this, if you want to find one factor that stands in stark antithesis to Nordic identity, as I've been trying to describe it, it would be this kind of thing. Right? One of the things that is often not understandable to people who are living identities. It's almost nonsensical to me that the world cannot see the difference between Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians, because to me as a Norwegian they are so huge and so important. Well, I wonder how many percent of Scandinavians would see the difference between members of the Polish minority and members of the Lithuanian majority in this country. I can report that Poland is the largest diaspora in Norway. And there are also, I don't have the exact figure, but I think there is something between 8,000 and 10,000 Lithuanians in Norway.
Between 40,000 and 60,000.
Really?
Yes.
That much? But
that many.
Ooh, that many. But then, that is a lot. Thank you.
Does it change the course of your
lecture? No, on the contrary. It makes it even more blatant that well, to me it's something else because I speak a Slavic language, so when people talk I can hear if they are Poles or not. But I wonder how many Norwegians would know the difference before people tell them that they are Poles or Lithuanians. And I know that this may sound strange when you're living one of those identities, but as seen from outside, that's it. And it then follows that if you project a political image of this being a very, very important and a very, very marred situation, you have an image problem. And I'm not in a position to talk about blame here at all. I'm an analytic that are looking at international relations, and I'm making the observation that this is a problem. And knowing something about the history of these parts, I also have a little problem understanding all the energy that goes into this and all the historical stuff that is underlying all this, but that's not the point. I was asked to talk about Nordic identities and Baltic identities and how the two stand in relationship to one another, and here I see a discrepancy. So once one has said something like that, one should also say something about similarities. And I would end on that note. There is a feeling in Europe that once you have ended up in the Balkans, you are in the Balkans. Once you end up in Central Europe, you're in Central Europe. And once you end up in Northern Europe, you're in Northern Europe. That is simply not historically correct. I've given one example, Finland. Let me give another, Slovenia. Slovenia spent decades trying to brand itself as a non-Baltic country, and it succeeded. Once it had succeeded, what did it do? It started talking about being a Baltic country, because in that way they could have the cake and eat it too. Because if you think in terms of international relations, the key point is to have as many identities and as many nodes in your network as possible. As wide a network and as strong a network as possible. So it is possible, for example, to be a Nordic and a Central European country at the same time. And it's possible, just like it is possible to be a Baltic and a Central European, a Balkan and a Central European country at the same time. So identities can be mutually exclusive, but they need not, in this case, in these kinds of collective identities that we're talking about here, need not be mutually exclusive. Just like a European identity and a national identity need not be mutually exclusive, a Nordic identity and a Baltic identity need not be mutually exclusive. But to the analysts, there are a number of things that you can point to and say that these are the places where the political energy are being encapsulated, and these are the things that have to change in order for identities to change. Thank you.